Opening the center with the queen's pawn immediately stakes a claim for central control. Developing the knight to a central square, preparing for pawn breaks and contest over the board's core. Asserting central control, this pawn advance immediately contests black's knight's influence. Embracing a solid, classical posture, black prepares to develop the bishop and contest the center, albeit with slightly less immediate pawn presence. Solidifying central influence, this knight prepares for kingside development and discourages any immediate d5 push. Confronting the center directly, this challenges white's pawn structure and seeks active piece play, potentially leading to early exchanges. Solidifying the center and developing a piece, white aims to contest black's pawn structure and prepare for further queenside expansion. Solidifying the center pawn structure, black opts for a classical queen's gambit declined setup, preparing to contest central space and develop pieces harmoniously. Pinning the knight develops the bishop and restricts black's queenside pawn breaks, creating immediate positional pressure. Challenging the bishop's placement immediately questions its long-term influence and potentially opens lines for counterplay. Sacrificing the bishop for the knight, this move fundamentally alters the pawn structure. Black's king will now be exposed on the weakened dark squares, creating long-term positional disadvantages as white aims to exploit that vulnerability. Reclaiming the queen immediately on f6 solidifies black's central pawn structure and preserves queen activity, though it sacrifices the bishop pair and presents a potential target on the diagonal should white's pieces advance. Solidifying the center and preparing for development, this move quietly aims to activate the queen's bishop, often a crucial piece in these queen's gambit decline structures. Embracing a fianchetto structure now fundamentally alters black's pawn complex, creating a potentially vulnerable kingside with that g6 advance, but simultaneously preparing to develop the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to contest the long light squares. A bold repositioning, the knight now occupies an advanced outpost, eyeing the black king's defensive structure with intent and pressuring the pawn chain. Solidifying the knight's central presence and preparing for potential pawn advances, this maneuver prepares for a dynamic repositioning of pieces, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development. Pioneering forward, f-pawn's advance seizes vital central squares, asserting dominance and creating potential attacking avenues on the kingside, though it somewhat weakens the light squares around white's own monarch. Finally, the dark-squared bishop finds an active diagonal, poised to influence the kingside and perhaps create threats along the long diagonal after some maneuvering. A bold assertion of central presence, this queen sortie instantly ignites a direct assault on black's king and creates immediate tactical complications around the vulnerable f7 square. Initiating an exchange on the knight frees up black's position, offering more dynamism and opening lines for the bishop to potentially become active. This decision addresses the immediate pressure from the white queen and knight, but requires careful follow-up to avoid being outmaneuvered. Opening the f-file offers significant attacking prospects, creating potential pressure on black's kingside. Shadowing the enemy queen across the board, this advance immediately targets white's awkwardly placed knight and disrupts any immediate kingside expansion, while simultaneously seeking to pry open lines for black's own powerful bishop on g7. Exchanging queens here simplifies the position dramatically, steering the game towards an endgame where white's central pawn majority on the kingside might prove advantageous. The pawn's advance, a structural concession, now opens the h-file for potential future pressure, but at the cost of creating a lingering weakness on the kingside that could become a target in quieter positions. The bishop finds a more active square, eyeing the kingside and potentially supporting a future e5 pawn push. Establishing a robust defensive outpost for the bishop, 13. bd7* aims to connect the rooks and prepare for castling kingside, bringing the monarch to a safer square while simultaneously unpinning the f6 pawn, allowing for future flexibility in the pawn structure. The king, now safely ensconced behind the pawn shield, can finally breathe easier, allowing white to reorient pieces towards central control and potential pawn pushes on the kingside. while black still wrestles with underdeveloped pieces and a slightly exposed monarch. The king embarks on a perilous journey towards the center, a bold statement of intent to activate its dormant power, but it concurrently exposes itself to potential danger from the increasingly aggressive white queenside battery. This maneuver hints at a rapid pawn race on the kingside for black, aiming to distract white and create tactical opportunities. Or perhaps it's a preemptive strike against white's looming central expansion, preparing to contest crucial squares. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing for potential rook activity down the open f-file feels like the core idea here, aiming to create imbalances. Solidifying the central pawn chain and preparing for potential operations along the f-file, black fortifies their structure. Consolidating pressure on the kingside by doubling rooks on the f-file, white aims to exploit the inherent structural weaknesses created by black's pawn advances, particularly the weakened dark squares around the king and the isolated g-pawn. Unlocking the h-file for potential infiltration, this move aggressively stakes a claim in the center and prepares to challenge white's advanced pawn, potentially creating a passed pawn later on. Opening the f-file so decisively, this captures the knight and forces a reaction, creating immediate imbalances and forcing black to confront the consequences of their king's exposed position on the 7th rank. Recapturing the pawn with the rook opens up the f-file, presenting a critical tactical battleground where the remaining pieces must now operate with precision, especially given the exposed nature of white's king. A decisive exchange unfolds, simplifying the position and leading towards an endgame where control of the open files will be paramount. Reclaiming the bishop and consolidating the material deficit signals black's intention to simplify into a more manageable endgame, even if it means accepting a slightly compromised pawn structure on the kingside. Capturing the pawn on d5 opens the c-file for your rook, creating immediate pressure and a pathway towards the queenside. This pawn exchange simplifies the central structure, transforming the position from a tense, blocked pawn chain into a more open scenario where piece activity becomes paramount, potentially leading to exchanges and an earlier endgame where rook placement will be decisive. Reclaiming the pawn on d5 solidifies black's pawn structure, but it creates a slight weakness on the e6 square which white might eye later. This seemingly passive recapture actually prepares for future development and reinforces black's central presence, albeit with a somewhat compromised pawn landscape. Seizing the initiative by claiming the pawn opens up the g-file, creating immediate pressure that black must address, potentially disrupting their defensive setup. The rook now asserts dominance over the open c-file, a crucial territorial gain in this unbalanced position. A crucial positional adjustment, the bishop repositions to prepare for potential pawn pushes or to support its rooks should they advance. This offers flexibility, anticipating black's next strategic maneuver in the center or on the queen side. Initiating a flank expansion with a pawn thrust aims to create space and potential attacking avenues on the queen side, though it might temporarily weaken the pawn structure there. Securing the king's shelter involves this subtle sidestep, offering a vital escape route should the h-file ever become a conduit for enemy incursions. It's a preemptive measure against potential future aggression and a testament to white's focus on robust king safety in this maneuvering phase. Black's pawn push on the queenside aims to break open lines and gain space, potentially leading to an active rook on the b-file, while simultaneously contesting white's central pawn majority. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure becomes paramount after this commitment, preventing any immediate queenside expansion from black. Shifting the king forward from the relative safety of the back rank, the black monarch seeks a more active post, aiming to participate in the burgeoning pawn endgame skirmishes and potentially support its own advanced passed pawns later in the game. Relocating the monarch to the king's flank addresses the immediate shelter needs, aiming to transition towards a more stable defensive setup and prepare for potential endgame scenarios where king activity becomes paramount. Consolidating the king's position, preparing for a potential reshuffle of black's forces, the monarch now has a more secure perch, sheltered from the looming bishop and rook. A crucial step in unifying the monarch's forces, This king repositioning facilitates the activation of the remaining pieces on the queenside and prepares for a potential central pawn push, aiming to destabilize black's somewhat static setup. Consolidating the bishop to the central diagonal, this piece now aims to influence the kingside from afar, a subtle counterpoint to white's potentially encroaching rooks. This maneuver redirects the king towards the queenside, initiating a subtle defensive consolidation as the rooks prepare to contest the central open file. The bishop repositions to h3, a quiet but crucial maneuver, aiming to control the long diagonal and prepare for potential piece exchanges while anchoring its influence on the queenside. Expanding the queenside with this pawn thrust aims to create space and potentially restrict black's bishop's scope, a subtle but important positional consideration in this closed structure. Controlling the critical dark squares around the bishop on d6 becomes paramount now, as black fortifies the b-pawn to prevent immediate pawn advances and prepares to potentially challenge white's control of the queenside. Anchoring the rook to the second rank reinforces the d-file's influence and prepares for potential pawn pushes on the queenside. A bold maneuver, aiming to reignite the rook's activity on the open file and challenge white's central grip, though it risks neglecting the pawn weaknesses that have accumulated on the queenside. A repositioning of the knight aims to improve its central presence and prepare for potential pawn pushes, possibly activating the h-pawn. Reigniting pressure on the b-file, this rook ventures into enemy territory, challenging white's entire queenside structure and threatening to exploit any weakness that emerges. Securing the open file demands immediate attention, and repositioning the rook to the now contested g-file aims to contest black's central pressure. Emboldening the center with pawn thrusts, black seeks to seize initiative and disrupt white's nascent kingside setup, potentially opening lines for an assault on the monarch. Relocating the king to the first rank, key 1*, aims to secure it behind the newly formed pawn wall and prepare for potential central action or a defensive repositioning, though it momentarily abandons the active central square. The game has devolved into a rather static positional struggle, with both sides having traded significant material. White's pawn structure in the center, while potentially giving them some space, also presents some weaknesses. Black's king, having been quite active for a while, is now seeking refuge, a common theme in these types of positions where tactical fireworks have subsided. Consider the implications of this king retreat on the central pawn tension, and the potential for white to eventually launch a pawn storm or exploit the open files if black isn't careful with their own king's safety. A bold recapture, anchoring the rook and preparing to cascade pressure down the open file against white's slightly exposed monarch. White reasserts pressure on the f-file, aiming to dislodge black's rook and potentially disrupt the pawn structure. Initiating a pawnless endgame with the exchange of rooks on the f-file dramatically alters the landscape, immediately focusing attention on the exposed white monarch and black's potential to exploit the open lines toward the king. The king, finally liberated from its defensive duties, now ventures into the center, seeking active participation in the ensuing endgame skirmish. The king's journey to the center is a bold gambit, seeking active participation in the ensuing skirmish. Repositioning the monarch to this central square, key 1*, aims to centralize the king's influence for the upcoming endgame phase, preparing to defend and potentially participate in pawn play while keeping an eye on potential threats across the board. Bringing the bishop back to c7 is a subtle maneuver, aiming to solidify the queenside pawns and prepare for a potential pawn storm with b4, while also keeping an eye on the central squares and the king's safety. The king's central promenade, so risky just moments ago, now seeks safety on the queenside, a strategic pivot hoping to outmaneuver the lurking bishop. Asserting influence over the queenside diagonal, this bishop repositions to eye white's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses down the b-file, a crucial area for controlling space as the game simplifies. Fortifying the queen's bishop's outpost and preparing to challenge that intrusive rook on the f-file. Relocating the bishop to this c6 square solidifies control over the central dark squares and offers a welcome repositioning after the previous pawn push, potentially preparing for a queenside expansion or supporting an eventual king march into the center. Transitioning the monarch across the board to a more active square like c3 aims to solidify its safety, while simultaneously preparing to contest the central files, a vital endgame maneuver. Recapturing the bishop on d7 opens a long-range diagonal for the remaining black bishop, potentially threatening white's king's side where the king currently resides, and also prepares to challenge white's queen's rook, which is currently tied down defending the c2 bishop. Initiating a subtle knight repositioning, aiming to reinforce the queenside majority and potentially create a bridgehead for the knight into the enemy territory. Seeking to disrupt white's well-anchored pieces, black ventures a pawn thrust to seize the initiative on the queenside, aiming to open lines and potentially create a passed pawn. Securing that open file for your rook is paramount, enabling it to pivot and support potential pawn pushes later in the game. Opening the queenside files with this pawn thrust forces white to react, creating dynamism where none existed and potentially exposing the light-squared bishop's diagonal. Opening the e-file finally allows the king to step into the fray, a crucial repositioning for the endgame that's shaping up. Controlling the queenside pawn advance is paramount. A4** halts the immediate march of white's b-pawn, aiming to create a static barrier and deny black further queenside expansion for the moment. Securing the knight on c5 creates a formidable outpost, challenging black's queenside structure and potentially dominating the d7 square. The black bishop repositions itself to a more active diagonal, eyeing the d5 pawn and potentially preparing to support a pawn push on the kingside or center. Solidifying the bishop's presence on the queenside, this maneuver prepares to contest the open b-file and potentially support a future b5 advance. A bold repositioning of the bishop, aiming to redeploy it to the long diagonal or perhaps even to control the central squares from afar, a crucial maneuver as white's knight vacates its central post. Clearing the path for the bishop to find more active squares on the queenside diagonal is the primary objective here, aiming to exploit the advanced pawn structure and create potential counterplay against white's king. Repositioning the bishop to c6 aims to solidify the pawn chain and potentially prepare for a kingside pawn push, but it allows white's knight to infiltrate the queenside out of the blue, disrupting black's defensive structure and creating potential weaknesses around the king. The bishop retreats, a tactical feint now complete, as white repositions this piece to better pressure black's isolated queenside pawns and prepare for potential breakthroughs. Gaining an outpost for the bishop on f4 is a good idea, but it comes at the cost of leaving the king somewhat exposed to potential long-range fire if the center opens further. The knight finds a more active square, eyeing the weak pawns on the kingside and aiming to support a potential pawn advance. Challenging the dominant bishop's influence opens a path for black's pieces to regroup, potentially preparing a sortie on the queenside. Refocusing the monarch's journey towards a more secure central haven after its recent nomadic wanderings around the board. Preparing to shift the bishop's influence, aiming to contest the crucial central diagonal and potentially support a pawn advance. Shifting the monarch forward aims to activate him for the endgame, potentially supporting a kingside pawn push or occupying a more central square. Recognizing the opportunity to disrupt white's central consolidation, black repositions the bishop, aiming to control the c2 square and deny white's knight easy access to the d4 outpost. This subtle redeployment prepares for a potential pawn push on the queenside, seeking to generate counterplay and exploit the slightly exposed nature of white's king. The bishop now relocates to a more active square, aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially exploit any weaknesses that arise from their advanced pawns. Unleashing the bishop to ***, opens up the e4 square for the knight, a subtle but potentially disruptive repositioning that could provoke weaknesses in white's pawn structure or offer tactical opportunities. A bold attempt to seize the initiative, this pawn push aims to disrupt black's harmonious piece setup and potentially create an escape square for the king, though it does weaken the kingside's pawn cover significantly and opens up further lines for black's bishops to exploit. Unleashing the bishop towards the kingside outposts, this maneuver looks to create some much-needed attacking pressure and potentially disrupt white's relatively stable position, even if it appears to be a quiet pawn push on the surface.